Earlier this week, I had the chance to get on a Zoom call and speak to a classroom full of students at the University of Portland about the history and practices of adoption in the United States. What you're about to see is a condensed version of that conversation. Just really my speaking, no pauses, no ums. I did my best to kind of take all that out. So I apologize if it's confusing, but I hope it makes sense. Thanks for watching.
I was adopted as an infant. My biological mother was an American teenager living in Ireland. My biological father was an Irish guy. My mom got pregnant, wasn't really ready to have a kid, wanted to raise me in the majority of her pregnancy, and my father apparently didn't really want anything to do with me, has kept me a secret to this day. That's really all I know about him. My mom comes back to America while she's pregnant, considers raising me, considers adoption, ultimately chooses adoption. And I was raised, in a typical suburban white family in the United States, but I also have this piece of me that's like half of me is Irish. I mean, there's a lot of there's kind of a trope in Irish, like with Irish Americans, that they're like, every American who's Irish thinks they're, Irish or whatever. But I actually have a father out there and siblings out there who I have never met before. So, I don't know, kind of a weird, unique adoption experience, I guess. It's really interesting to look at adoption. I think a lot of people look at adoption as kind of a means of family building, because when you don't have a huge, profound connection to adoption, it's really just an opportunity for you, right? Oh, I can maybe grow my family with this child. I might have a friend or a family member who, has adopted a child. But adoption really is not an ancient practice. It's like a centuries old practice, I would say, that really dates back. I mean, it's probably been around for most of American history, but really things started to change in the early 1900s, the 1920s. Globally, it's kind of the same thing. America has really been at the forefront of adoption as an institution. I look at it more as the system. And in the early 1920s, even maybe a little bit before that in America, adoption was not really a huge common thing. It was maybe a handful of kids in the United States were getting adopted every year, let's say dozens of kids at max, maybe. Obviously a smaller country, but also adoption wasn't really what it is today. A mother who's pregnant, who may not be able to care for her kid, gets help, right? She has a government that might be able to give her money to take care of her kid. She might have family members or community members who are interested in helping her raise her child because the child's part of the broader community. In the early 1920s, and even before that, a huge movement started, which was called the orphan trade movement. Very interesting history that really not a lot of people talk about, but there were a lot of kids living, especially in the Northeast, in New York, and that kind of area, that didn't have parents, were orphans essentially. And America thought, well, we can kind of kill two birds with one stone. We can get these kids off the streets, and we can kind of meet the needs of people who want children but can't have children. And so they would ship kids in trains from New York across the US, especially to the Midwest, states like Minnesota, where these children would be sent to farms to basically be free laborers. At the same time, and a little bit after that, there was a woman named Georgia Tann who was a social worker. There's a very good book about her called The Baby Thief. But basically, she worked in adoption, and she realized there was a lot of money to be made. It costs $7 to adopt a child, the equivalent of about $100 to $200 in today's money. And children at the time were not very desirable, adoptable children, I should say. It was very much this attitude of why would I raise someone else's kid? Or there was the whole eugenics movement. So people thought that children that were unwanted, so to speak, came from a bad place. They had bad genetics. They were literally subhuman in some ways. And she kind of realized, she was a very good marketer, she realized that she could present these children as blank slates. Essentially, they're cut from a higher cloth. She would lie about their histories, the dad is a doctor, the mom is a famous musician or something. And then she would sell these children to couples, predominantly in New York and California, but really just taking poor children and selling them to rich families was kind of the base of her model. And instead of charging $7, she would charge thousands of dollars in many cases, but really hundreds to thousands of dollars. She did that, she made a bunch of money doing it, and realized there's kind of a shortage of adoptable children, so to speak. And so she started literally kidnapping children. She had her means of acquiring children. She worked with very corrupt people. She had a very large influence in Memphis politics, worked with a very corrupt guy who's basically in charge of the whole city, and made adoption a massive institution. And at the core of adoption, what a lot of adopted people argue for, whether they're anti-adoption or not anti-adoption in today's day and age, is the fact that adopted people have two birth certificates. So I have two birth certificates. I didn't even know that until I was in my late 20s. Georgia Tann started falsifying birth certificates because she realized that these women would look for their children, these families would look for their children, the children would look for their families. And so by kind of creating a new identity for the child, there's not a way for these kidnapped children to be able to like find the families that they came from, or the families to find the children. Adoption agencies eventually kind of realized Georgia Tam was a human trafficker. I mean, people did realize that at a certain point, but nothing really changed because ultimately this big new industry with social work and adoption was created, and it made sense. It served a lot of people's needs. There were a lot of arguments that, adoption was a cheaper method of caring for these unwanted or undesirable children than putting them in a foster home, maintaining the orphanages that used to exist in America. I mean, they don't really exist anymore today to many extents. So when I look at adoption, I really look at America versus other countries. For example, in Australia, I think it's like there's less adoptions in Australia per year than there are in America per day, like excluding step-parent adoptions. America has a very unique attitude about caring for children where we would rather kind of save taxpayer money than provide resources for parents to raise their children. Not to say that, every person who loses a child or relinquishes a child to adoption wants to parent or has or got their child stolen from them, so to speak. But in many cases, $100, $1,000 may have been the difference between someone parenting or not parenting. And you can see in other countries, in Europe especially, but also, like I said, Australia, I think New Zealand as well, adoption rates are microscopic compared to the US. Now, to get really quick into the inter-country adoption, transnational adoption, around the time of the Korean War, I don't remember the exact decade, I'm sure I might have said that in the video you guys saw, America really started realizing that there was a huge demand for adoptable children. I think in the article that I saw when I was making that video yesterday, it was like 1,000 families wanted to adopt children, and there were only like 100,000 adoptable children per year. And so this Holt Children's Services, that adoption agency that was the big one between Korea and the United States, was bringing as many kids to America as they possibly could because there's money to be made. And this wasn't just in Korea, this was in Ireland as well. That was not the case with my mother, but there's a good book called Banished Babies, which talks about the orphan trade from Ireland to the US. It happened in Guatemala as well, a lot of other countries where basically we kind of just have this idea, and it's predominantly kind of an evangelical idea movement of like the late 1950s to 90s, I would say, where the church got really involved with adoption and started to kind of look at adoption as a means of evangelism, of spreading God's message, taking care of these orphans, and really was rooted in this idea that America is a better place for a child to grow up than the cold, whatever of Korea. I was actually working on a video earlier today that I haven't posted yet. That was literally, it was like the guy who ran Holt Adoption Agency, which is like actually incidentally started in Oregon. He said something about, America being this like warm country as opposed to the coldness of Korea for war orphans or whatever. And so there's a level of kind of caring for children in all of this madness, but at the same time, the critical part of me looks at adoption, looks at an institution that really cares more about finding adoptable children for families than actually looking at children and thinking, how can we care for this child specifically? I think the institution of adoption in America, we kind of look at it, like I kind of alluded to earlier, as a two birds, one stone approach, where there's this pool of children that may or may not have families that care about them, that want them. In many cases they do, but let's not say in every case. And you have this big group of people that wants to adopt children, wants to care for children. And obviously, as your professor understands, foster care really is a means of trying to, not to be dismissive of what the work that people in the foster care system do, but essentially you look at it as kind of an extended babysitter, right? It exists as a way for children's parents to kind of get their shit together while someone else cares for the child. And then hopefully once things are better, the child returns to their parents. And that's kind of the goal. What's really happened in recent years is that adoption lobbying groups and adoption agencies have realized that the pool of adoptable infants abroad and even domestically is drying up. And so they've gotten more involved in foster care, trying to kind of expedite adoptions from foster care as well. The adoption system in the US, I would say, is very much a marketplace. People want children, they want to own the children. It's not good enough to just, kind of be a part of the child's life and acknowledge the child's parents as parents. People want to be mom and dad, and for better or for worse, that's the way it is. I understand why people would want that for themselves. Adoption is a form of external care, right? There's different ways you can care for a child. You can have essentially the exact same thing as adoption, minus the Georgia Tan erasing the birth certificate and creating a new document that says that you were born to the people who adopted you. You know, I'm fortunate enough that I have both my documents, but there are a lot of adopted people out there who literally don't have a piece of paper that tells them who their own parents are, or the people that birthed them, if people don't really consider those people parents. But a lot of adopted people do, and that's information about your identity that's really taken away from you, or that you're not given access to. Even in a liberal state like California, we don't have unconditional access to our own birth certificates. So adoption, and to the point that you're making about getting paid by the government, right? There's this idea that adoption is just better for children, that we will actually, taxpayers will subsidize adoptions, that people who adopt children beyond whatever payments you might get in a particular state, and it's not every adoption that the adopters get, thousands of dollars a month from the government, hundreds of dollars, whatever it may be. Everyone who adopts a child, for the most part, except if they're very, very rich, gets a $15,000 tax break from the federal government, which that's money that we're paying people to care for these strangers' children, essentially, in many cases, that we've never offered to the families of origin. What would have $100, $1,000, $5,000 have done for a mother who wants to raise her child? And really, it goes beyond adoption, right? I mean, we're in a country with a massive cost of living crisis. Social safety nets are not the priority for many, politicians in the government. And really, what would $1,000 for any mother, whether she's thinking about adoption or not, be able to do for a family? In America, for better or for worse, I'd argue for worse, has really taken a stance that no free handouts, we don't want to give money to people to support their families. Whereas, in many other countries, you'll see these governments handing out money because these are the future laborers of our workforce. These are the future parents of our children. And so why not support the parents? Why not support the family in a way if they need support? I would say that adoption is just very much a byproduct of America not really caring for our own people. It's really sad. I know who my parents are. I know my mom. I have really close family connections with that side of my family. I know my dad's name. I know the people in that family, even though I've never connected with them. But there's a huge group of adopted people who have to pay, to get DNA testing because they want to know who their family is. They pay a search angel to try to find their family. I had to petition the court for my own documents to prove, I got my Irish passport. I had to pay like hundreds of dollars. I'm fortunate enough that it wasn't a huge barrier for me, but I mean, to get my own passport documentation that I should be entitled to, I had to pay the government like hundreds of dollars just to prove I am who I've always been. It's a very demeaning process for some people. And for me, I can tolerate it because I'm just in the adoption world a lot. But yeah, it's really a challenge for a lot of adopted people. To answer the question of like, why do it? It's, I think, very much a matter of adoption agencies want to create as much demand as possible. They kind of want to have it both ways. They kind of want to pretend like we care about the kids, we're doing this for the children, but at the same time, they want to have as many customers as possible. If giving people the ability to find those families unconditionally, if that's something that might scare off someone who wants to adopt a child, that's bad for their business, right? And ultimately, they take a lot of money from people who never end up adopting. You pay an adoption agency a fee, you're with them for a year, you don't have a successful adoption, you don't get that money back, right? You have to either pay them again to keep going, or you don't pay them. And adopting from foster care is different, but in terms of like the private infant adoption, I think these businesses really there doesn't do anything to help their business to reverse that thing. And I should have a better answer than that because I just read a book about like the Georgia Tan and birth certificate stuff. But yeah, it's a really complicated issue, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. There's a few states that adopted people have lobbied very hard to get access to our birth certificates. I know Georgia actually I think they just won in Georgia like this week. But yeah, California, we're still fighting. And I think Oregon, they actually have their birth certificate access. I could be wrong, but yeah. I'd say it was a combination of kind of like, I grew up, I had this experience. I thought it was positive for many years of my life. I wouldn't say it's entirely negative, right? Like my adoptive mother is like in the room watching my kid when she wakes up while I'm on the call right now. I think that like this idea of open adoption, which I really haven't talked about in this 20 minutes or whatever, is something that really is challenging for me. I think like open adoption, the idea of like well, we want to like be able to give a child access to their family, but we want this other family to raise the child. It's always kind of been advertised as kind of this like win-win-win. The child doesn't lose as much. The adoptive family still gets to be the parents, and then the natural family, the family of origin, still gets to see the child. But open adoption, at least in private infant adoption, is really a marketing tactic. And when I realized that, I started getting really into this adoption stuff. I had a kid, and that really gave me like a midlife crisis in my mid-20s where I was like freaking out because all of a sudden everything that seemed positive was all like really overwhelming and negative. And I realized a lot of the emotional challenges I've had through my life, mental health issues, all stem from kind of this like maternal separation and all of the challenging adoption topics. I think what really made me want to start speaking out about adoption is that the fact that I've been in marketing. So I've looked at a lot of these ads that adoption agencies run just out of curiosity, as well as I've read a lot of books, I've read a lot of literature, listened to podcasts, and a lot of people would they would give the whole spiel and at the end be like, well, open adoption actually kind of fixed everything. Even adopted people I've heard say that. And I always felt the same feelings as everyone else. I was like, I don't really know how this doesn't apply to me because I'm in these support groups with all these other people who didn't have the exact same experience, but I'm feeling those same feelings. And for me, I just really am passionate about, I want to tear down adoption, not for the sake of, righting the wrongs that I've experienced, as much as if we care about children, if we care about these families, let's like do right by them. Let's not operate under these like shady pretenses. I look at adoption agencies, it's just mostly on the private side. The foster system I'm not as interested in, just out of my own personal experience, but I look at kind of the way that adoption agencies operate and trying to get people to give them their children. They spend about $10,000 per child in advertising. The customers that they're advertising to are not the people that are coming to their business and making the purchase. Those are the customers that they deal with, like in a business practical sense. But the people they're advertising to are the people who are giving them their children for free and not really being compensated at all for that, except if maybe that adoption agency is paying for housing during their pregnancy or something like that. It's a very weird kind of business, and I just look at it and uncomfortable with it. And I wish things were different for every person involved, including the adopters. My adoptive parents, I think, would have loved for things to have been different and for them to have been more equipped and being told, hey, Connor's not going to be exactly the same way as any other kid. He's actually very different and his brain works very differently. And he has a lot of, trauma from the experience that he's dealt with. Yeah, 100%. I think thanks for the question. I think adoption is really in my eyes, is like a failure to take care of the people. And I think when you look at other countries, the reason adoption rates are so low is because they do take care of their people. And people who have support, like whether familial, whether from the government, whether from the community, whether from whoever, I think there's a lot of propaganda when it comes to like the pro-life, pro-choice kind of, argument, whatever, where one side is like looking at it as a term, as like the woman's choice. The other side's looking at it as like the baby essentially, and nothing beyond that. And what gets conflated, I think, in many cases is we're like, what I would say if I was to make like a pro-choice argument is like, when we are looking at, kind of this argument, and to your point, the idea of like the American exceptional like ideal being raising a family, like why are we kind of creating these incentives to bring children into a country or into a world that isn't ready for that child? And I think in many cases, the reason that a lot of people in this country want to like have people carry out pregnancies, even if they're not ready to raise that child, is because there's this idea in their head that, well, those children will go into the pool of adoptable infants. In fact, in the Dobbs decision, that was a huge thing for a lot of adopted people that really got a lot of people's brains moving. And that was prior to when I started doing what I'm doing. But I can tell if you look at any of like the big adoption influencers, which probably no one in this room knows, which is totally fine. A lot of those people started making videos right around the Dobbs decision because one of the justices, I believe Alito, wrote in the comments of the decision or something. I don't know every single detail of it, but he said something about maintaining like a supply of infants available for adoption in this country. There's this idea that if women carry out a pregnancy for 9 months, they're going to have no issue with just giving that child to complete strangers. Whereas actually when you look at the research, and there's a really good book on this called Relinquished by Gretchen Sisson, she's done a lot of the research and found that actually it's like more than 80% of women who, shocker, like carry out a pregnancy for 9 months aren't really like doing that because they want to give the gift of their child to a stranger. They're thinking, I want to, care for my child. I want to raise my child. And then usually if they make a choice to relinquish the child, it's in the last term of that pregnancy or later because they feel like they're not resourced to parent the children. And so I think it's a very opportunistic kind of attitude that we have as a society. And I used to feel like exactly this way, where it was like, adoption's great. It gives these kids a home. It like kills all these birds with one stone. But really, I think if you like kind of peel back the curtain and look at it more critically, I think a lot of it is kind of this self-serving attitude of like, well, if women who aren't ready to parent carry out their pregnancies, that gives adoption agencies more babies to kind of, deal with. There's a lot of issues. And I think like, my 2 cents of the foster system is that in the 1990s, Bill Clinton passed what's called, I believe it's the Adoption and Safe Families Act, which had good intentions, but created incentives for states to have more adoptions per year. I don't know the exact details offhand, but essentially think of it as if you're a state, the federal government will give you a certain amount of money. If from one year you have 1,000 adoptions from foster care, and then the next year you have 2,000 from foster care, that you get more money from the federal government to operate, which every state is competing for federal dollars. Everyone wants money, and so, but with this idea, what we've seen is this really the adoption agencies getting very involved in foster care and realizing that we can make a lot of money doing this. Because again, they're charging crazy amounts of money for adoptable children. Again, if you adopt through foster care through the state, you might not pay a lot of money. The state is going to end up paying that price. But we've created these incentives really to separate children from their families. We're not giving them money, and on top of that, these states are actually they have a reason to not want the child to end up with their family of origin. Does it mean that every single child that's adopted is adopted for the wrong reasons or whatever? Not necessarily, but it's just a human thing. But especially in America, we're driven by incentives. If my boss is going to give me $30,000 if I work a little bit harder, I either going to work a little bit harder to try to get that, or I'm not going to work harder and not expect that. When you are kind of dangling this idea of hey, you can have this money if more kids get adopted out of your state, out of your foster care system, states are going to try to terminate parental rights earlier. Thanks for having me. Thanks for listening, guys.